1,000 years ago, men believed that the Earth was flat. 500 years ago, men believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and that the sun, moon, and stars all circled the Earth. 200 years ago, men believed that it was impossible for stones to fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. Meteorites, they argued, were merely stones on Earth that had been struck by lightning. 100 years ago, men believed that man could never fly. Bishop Wright said that flying was reserved for the angels. His two sons, Wilbur and Orville, later proved their father wrong. 50 years ago, Sir Harold Spencer Jones, the director of the Greenwich Observatory, predicted that man would never set foot on the surface of the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
30 years ago, stories about UFOs circling the globe and landing on this planet were considered hoaxes or hallucinations. Yet more than 15 million witnesses, equipped with photographs, movies, videos, physical records, and scientific data, have proven again that man can be wrong. Most people today envision UFOs to be exactly as they are portrayed in most science fiction films and books. This is, of course, a relatively recent conception that has been stimulated perhaps by our expanding knowledge of outer space. But strange sights appeared in the skies long before spaceflight or manned flight of any kind was possible. And in each century, these visions took on identities that tell much about the worldview of those who saw them. Alexander the Great and his army, for instance, were harassed by a pair of flying objects in 329 BC. Most of the soldiers fled the scene, but some of the hardier men stood their ground and tried to hit the discs with their arrows and with stones from their slings. In 1492, just 4 hours before discovering land, Christopher Columbus saw a bright glowing object come out of the sky, go into the water, and travel slowly through the water very close to the ship that he was on. Engraved onto a French token minted in the 1860s is a disc-shaped flying object that experts say may have commemorated a daytime UFO sighting. The great British astronomer Edmund Halley of comet fame also saw a series of unexplained aerial objects in March of 1716. One of them lit up the sky for more than 2 hours and was so brilliant that Halley could read a printed text by its light. There were sightings in 1897 of a lighter-than-air ship that had propellers, porthole windows, and brilliant searchlights, which it directed at the ground. In 1917, what may have been the largest crowd ever to witness a UFO occurred in Fatima, Portugal. 50,000 people watched in amazement as a huge silver disc began spinning like a windmill and dancing about in the sky. After plunging toward the Earth, it climbed back into the sky and disappeared into the sun. One night during the summer of 1948, Clyde W. Tombaugh, the astronomer who discovered the planet Pluto, was sitting in the back of his home at Las Cruces, New Mexico. He and several witnesses, including other members of his family, watched a strange glowing craft move overhead. All of the witnesses agreed that the object was definitely a solid ship and that it was probably some form of extraterrestrial device. World War II Allied Air Force pilots reported UFO sightings over Germany. They appeared out of nowhere and seemed to be toying with the aircraft. Military pilots termed them Foo fighters, Foo being the French word for fire. Retired Air Force Major Paul Deutsch describes an encounter with his crew over Japan.
The particular one that my crew saw was an orange-red color, and it paced our aircraft for miles and miles off the left horizontal stabilizer. We don't know how far off. It's very difficult to determine. And so the top gunner, who had control of all the guns in the back of this B-29 bomber fired a burst. The tracers were seen to go directly toward it, but nothing happened. It's at that time that I saw it. We thought it was a Japanese secret device, probably developed by the Germans. And I might add that the fellows over in the European theater thought it was a German device, and the Germans thought it was an Allied secret weapon, and everybody thought it was somebody else's. No one knew what it was.
On December 5th, 1945, a squadron of 5 Avenger torpedo bombers with 14 experienced crew members flew out of Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida. It was a short, routine flight. Each plane had a full load of fuel, and weather conditions were excellent. But something strange happened. The flight leader called in and reported not having any sense of direction. Air Control then ordered the squadron to head due west. The leader, with alarm in his voice, then said, "We don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong, strange. We can't be sure of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." He then stated that weird, unidentified aircraft were closing in on them. His radio went dead. All 5 planes disappeared without leaving a trace. A giant Martin Mariner with a crew of 13 was dispatched to search for the 5 missing planes. It had the capability to land on the roughest of seas, but this plane also disappeared into the grim silence of the Atlantic. What followed was the greatest search operation in history. For 5 days, an armada of 300 planes and 21 ships crisscrossed the sea and sky, but no trace of the 6 aircraft or 27 crew members were to be found. To this day, it remains a mystery as to what happened. Some believe the mystery may be found in the UFO phenomenon, wherein lie a number of questions. Could UFOs possibly be real? If so, what intelligent forces are behind them? What are their intentions? Are they hostile, friendly, or merely curious? Where do they come from? Do they originate on Earth, or do these machines and creatures come from somewhere out among those mysterious winking stars in the black vastness of space? Orson Welles comments.
The discovery of just one bacteria on Mars, or any other body of the solar system, would indicate that the whole chain of evolutions, cosmic, chemical, and biological, is at work everywhere. In that case, the creation of life anywhere in the universe would be more the rule than the exception. In that case, there may be other intelligent civilizations capable of communicating with us. In the impact on ourselves of contact with another intelligent civilization, how it might come about and what the effects might be, is now being discussed by serious thinkers the world over. This symposium at Boston University includes astronomer Carl Sagan, anthropologist Ashley Montague. Krista Stendhal is Dean of the Harvard School of Divinity. Professor Berenson teaches a course entitled Search for Life in the Universe. Professor Philip Morrison of MIT co-authored the first seriously reasoned paper on possible modes of communication with extraterrestrial life. George Wald won the Nobel Prize in 1971 for his work in physiology.
The most optimistic estimates, in the view of many, about the number of civilizations that there might be in the galaxy is of the order of 1 million, which means that only 1 in a few 100,000 stars has such a civilization.
That would mean a billion such places just in our own galaxy that might contain life.
As I believe there's a society of these groups, not just one. There are probably very many. If there's only one, we have no hope of finding him. There are probably thousands, maybe as many as 1 million.
When we speak of life beyond Earth, what we generally mean is, of course, intelligent life, something resembling our noble selves. It is highly probable that there are such intelligent forms of life in other galaxies in the universe. And it is even more probable that many of these forms are vastly more intelligent than we.
I'd like to quote a short passage from a recent report of the Astronomy Survey Committee of the prestigious and august National Academy of Sciences of the United States, probably the nation's most distinguished scientific body. This was printed in May of this year. Quote, "Each passing year has seen our estimate of the probability of life in space increase, along with our capabilities of detecting it. More and more scientists feel that contact with other civilizations is no longer something beyond our dreams, but is a natural event in the history of mankind."
The dream of this so-called natural event began on October 12, 1992, when NASA's SETI program, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, began a 10-year, $100 million project whose sole purpose is to seek the answer to a single question: is man alone in the universe? The centerpiece of the SETI program is the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico. Its 1,000-foot wide antenna dish makes it the most powerful telescope in the world, with the effective power of 20 trillion watts. It is manned by more than 100 physicists, astronomers, computer programmers, and technicians who are staring at control panels in hopes of discovering radio waves that were created by intelligent beings. But why all of this special attention to the search of intelligent life beyond Earth? Some would argue that it is the byproduct of what has become known as the modern flying saucer era, which began on June 24, 1947. Kenneth Arnold, a 32-year-old Boise, Idaho businessman, was flying his single-engine plane over the Cascade Mountains of Washington. Arnold tells his story.
I had reached the altitude of about 9,200 feet when a very brilliant flash lit the sky around me and actually lit up the airplane that I was flying. And I could see way off to the right, coming in the vicinity of Mount Baker, a whole chain-like string of aircraft coming at a tremendous speed. I could see plainly that they didn't have any tails. I had never seen aircraft of that kind. And I made a quick judgment that they must be approximately 100 foot in their wingspan. And the first unit or first craft flew at a higher altitude than the last. And of course, this is completely reversed from our normal flight patterns. I had a good fix with Mount Adams, and I thought I'd try to clock their speed between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams.
Arnold estimated the speed of the craft at an astounding 1,700 miles per hour, nearly 3 times faster than any jet he had ever heard of. He was asked by a reporter to describe the mysterious objects.
You know, they would skip and sail and give off these flashes, and you take a saucer and you skip it across the water, and it's erratic. And this is how the name Flying Saucer was born.
This was the day, June 24th, 1947, that marked the beginning of what is known as the modern flying saucer era. What followed would be thousands upon thousands of unidentified flying objects over North America as well as other parts of the world.
It seemed to hover for a matter of maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and then was out of sight within 2 or 3 seconds, which was a lot faster than it had been traveling originally.
We were using our red lights and our aircraft landing lights, which is a spotlight, and pointing them or directing them at the UFO. And it was reacting to it audibly on occasion, and it did make a movement towards the lights. As we turned the light off, then it would return to its original position and remain stationary again, but it was reactive to the lights.
I judged it to be at least 150 feet across it. It was saucer-shaped with a high dome. It was very shiny underneath. It was a porcelain-type finish. And I was getting a tremendous shock all over my whole body. My hair was standing up, and I had electrical static feeling over my hair on my arms and my head. I thought it was doomsday.
He was standing at the doorway screaming at me to get up. We got to get out of here. It's going to get us. And I looked out there, and it was pitch black when I first looked. And by now, he's got a hold of me, and he's shaking me, and he's screaming at me, which Bill doesn't scream. I mean, he's just hysterical is the way I can explain the way he was. And he keeps telling me, we've got to get the kids out of here, it's going to get us. And I didn't see anything. So I looked again, and all of a sudden I saw this like a real bright light. And I still didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know what had scared him. But after looking at the way he was and looking at what I saw, I knew I better listen to him. So I went down the hallway and grabbed my daughter. And I came back to the hallway and went out the front door, and he had grabbed our son by then.
When he came back up the second time, I felt like death was at hand. I think this was it. And as soon as it touched down, then the whole area just lit up.
You couldn't see anything inside, but you could see the outline of the whole object. It was going through the sky. Not really, it didn't seem to be going really fast. After a while, it just started straight up in the air.
They were about 4 feet 10. Had very large heads. No hair on their heads. No eyebrows. No whiskers or anything like that. They had very large eyes.
The odor itself, I smelled stronger when the beings were near me. And when they looked at me, we did not talk verbally like we're talking now. It was a telepathy type thing.
A recent Gallup poll estimates that 1 out of every 2 Americans believe in the existence of UFOs. Over 15 million people have reported seeing UFOs, of which over 2,000 were encounters with landed UFOs and their occupants. UFOs have been fired upon by jet fighters and anti-aircraft missiles, but with no effect. They give off powerful electromagnetic charges, often causing the breakdown of engines and electrical circuitry. They evoke strange and fearful reactions in animals and frequently cause profound psychological disturbances in humans. They have the ability to materialize as if from nowhere, but more often vanish into thin air in the midst of a sighting. Both human eyes and radar instruments have observed unbelievable aerial maneuvers, such as 90-degree turns of several thousand miles per hour, and have been clocked at speeds up to 16,000 miles per hour. There can be no longer any doubt, even to the most ardent skeptic, that UFOs exist. The question is, where do they come from? If they come from another galaxy, then they would come from at least 2 million light years away. Even traveling at light speed, 186,000 miles per second, it would take 2 million years to get here. But suppose that UFOs come from some distant star in our own galaxy. If these space visitors were to travel 1 million miles a day, it would take 70,000 years to reach the Earth from the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, which is 25.5 trillion miles from Earth. Other stars are thousands of times further out in space. Conservative estimates indicate that a spaceship carrying 10 people and traveling 5 light years to and from a nearby star system at 70% of the speed of light would consume 500,000 times the amount of energy used in the United States in 1 year. But there are other complications of space travel. Space is not a vacuum, but contains cosmic gas, dust, and particles. Nobel Prize winner Professor Edward Purcell of Harvard points out that a space vehicle traveling at the speed of light would collide with this space material in the form of radiation and with the impact of several hundred atom smashers. On the afternoon of January 7th, 1948, an unidentified flying object was sighted over Godman Air Force Base at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The base tower sent 4 F-51 jets to investigate. The flight leader, Captain Thomas F. Mantell, reported seeing the object, and at 3:15 p.m., he broke away from the formation in pursuit of the object. A few moments later, he radioed the tower. "I'm closing in now to take a good look. It's directly ahead and above, and still moving at about half my speed. The thing looks metallic and of tremendous size. I'm going up to 20,000 feet, and if I'm no closer, I'll abandon chase." Those were the last words that Captain Mantell ever spoke. Later in the day, his body was found in a nearby field, the wreckage of his plane scattered for half a mile around. There were many other sightings that year. In July 1948, it was reported from Strategic Air Command in San Antonio to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that an unidentified aircraft was seen by an Eastern Airlines pilot, co-pilot, and one or more passengers flying over Montgomery, Alabama. The aircraft was reported to be of an unconventional type, without wings, and resembled generally a rocket ship of the type depicted in comic strips. It was reported to have had windows, to have been larger than the Eastern Airlines plane, and to have been traveling at an estimated speed of 2,700 miles per hour. It narrowly missed a collision with the Eastern Airlines plane. And from an FBI memorandum dated March 14, 1949, comes this report. Flying discs are believed by the Air Force to be man-made missiles rather than some natural phenomenon, and that as much as 4 years ago, it was learned that some type of flying discs were being experimented upon by the Russians. It was further determined that most all of the flying discs seen by persons in the United States approached this country from a northerly direction and returned in the same direction, indicating a strong possibility that they are coming from Russia. On the evening of July 19, 1952, Senior Air Controller Harry G. Barnes at National Airport in Washington, D.C., picked up 7 slow-moving objects on his radar scope. He called Andrews Air Force Base and learned that they were seeing the identical blips on their radar. A pair of F-94 Air Force jets were soon searching the skies over Washington, where they found nothing. As soon as the jets departed, the blips reappeared on radar screens and remained there until daybreak. A week later, Harry Barnes picked up 10 more objects on radar. Andrews Air Force Base confirmed that the same unknown objects were on their radar scopes as well. Barnes called the Pentagon, and another pair of jets came howling over Washington. But now the UFOs remained visible on the screens, and one of the jet fighters reported a visual sighting of 4 lights. At one point, the pilot radioed that the lights were surrounding his plane. But soon the UFOs sped away and disappeared into the night. Later that morning, Harry Barnes made this statement, quote, "There is no other conclusion that I can reach, but that for 6 hours on the morning of the 26th of July, there were at least 10 unidentifiable objects moving above Washington. They were not ordinary aircraft, nor in my opinion could any natural phenomena account for these spots on our radar," end quote. The Pentagon was inundated with questions from the press, and President Harry Truman asked Secretary of Defense Forrestal to find out what in the world, or out of it, was going on. On October 27, 1952, the FBI issued this memorandum. Air intelligence still feels flying saucers are optical illusions or atmospherical phenomena. But some military officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. Investigative journalist Frank Edwards, author of Flying Saucers, Serious Business, offers the following commentary.
This is Frank Edwards reporting. How real are the flying saucers, officially called unidentified flying objects? On December 24, 1959, the Inspector General of the Air Force notified all Air Base commanders that flying saucers are a serious problem. The government of the United States has issued orders advising the military how to recognize the UFOs, how to report them, and how to handle fragments of them. Slowly but surely, the nature and extent of this remarkable phenomenon has become public knowledge. By patiently piecing together these bits of evidence as they become available, by carefully weighing the guarded statements of scientists and military agencies involved in the study of unidentified flying objects, we shall see that they are indeed serious business.
The variety of witnesses of UFOs is endless. They include military personnel from the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, radar specialists, aeronautical engineers, airport traffic controllers, astronomers, FBI agents, state, county, and city police, pilots and crews from American, United, Eastern, Pan American, Northwest, Western, and TWA, were also on the list of witnesses. Millions in the United Kingdom, France, Australia, South America, Mexico, and other nations around the world have seen UFOs. For 18 years, the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek headed up the Air Force investigation into UFOs, called Project Blue Book, and was acknowledged to be the world's foremost authority on UFOs. After amassing a computer bank of over 63,000 sightings, he states,
"The UFO phenomenon is truly a phenomenon of our times. It is an extremely puzzling one and calls forth a wide spectrum of opinions. No matter what one may think about UFOs, no matter what one may believe about them, whether it is all nonsense or whether they represent something very, very real, three facts stand out, three facts which no one can deny. The first is that UFO reports exist. Secondly, that UFO reports come from all over the world. And the third is that many are made by highly responsible people, often scientifically trained. We scientists have no positive proof yet of the origin or even of the reality of these strange reported craft, but we do know that the reports themselves are very real. To find the answer to this magnificent scientific puzzle, the UFO phenomenon, we need to approach it with a truly open mind so we can explore all possible avenues of explanation."
Among those who claimed to have seen UFOs was Senator Barry Goldwater, who said, quote, "Flying saucers, unidentifiable flying objects, or whatever you want to call them, are real," end quote. Astronaut Gordon Cooper said, quote, "I believe these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets, and they're obviously a lot more technically advanced than we are here on Earth," end quote. Prince Philip of England is a flying saucer fanatic. He meticulously charts all important saucer sightings on a gigantic wall map in his private study at Buckingham Palace. General Douglas MacArthur was the supreme commander of all Allied forces in the South Pacific during World War II. He believed in UFOs and even commissioned a report that was over 20,000 pages long. During one of his last speeches to the cadets at West Point, he said, "Gentlemen, the next war will not be an international war, but an intergalactic war." He assumed that not only were there UFOs from another planet, but that they were hostile. One fall evening in 1969, Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter was preparing for a speech in the little town of Leary when he spotted a bright object in the western sky. Carter describes his experience.
There were about 20 of us standing outside of a little restaurant, I believe, a high school lunchroom, and a kind of a green light appeared in the western sky. This was right after sundown, and it got brighter and brighter, and then eventually it disappeared. It was not, didn't have any solid substance to it. It was just a very peculiar-looking light. None of us could understand what it was.
Former President Ronald Reagan made statements concerning UFOs on 18 different occasions while in office. The following is an excerpt from one of his speeches.
I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?
After leaving the White House, Reagan admitted to having seen a UFO while he was governor of California. He was aboard the governor's plane at the time. His wife, Nancy, as well as several other people, also saw it and described it as a green, glowing UFO. They chased it for some 300 miles before it went out of the plane's range. On November 7th, 1975, an alarm went off at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, the site of launching facilities for Minuteman missiles. A sabotage alert team immediately went to the site, where they saw a glowing orange disk the size of a football field hovering over the area. It began to rise, and the North American Air Defense Command radar picked it up when it reached an altitude of 1,000 feet. 2 F-106 jet fighters were dispatched from Great Falls, Montana to intercept the craft. But before the fighters arrived, it disappeared from the radar screens. The next day, there were more sightings. guns, both visual and radar, over the base. Each time the jets screamed into the area, the UFOs shut off their lights and reappeared only after the jets left. In the next 8 months, 130 similar reports were logged at the base and in the surrounding county. An early and prominent champion of UFOs was one Donald E. Kehoe, a U.S. Naval Academy graduate and retired Marine Corps major. In the January 1950 issue of True magazine, he wrote a comprehensive article on UFOs. It caused an instant sensation and became one of the most widely read and discussed articles of the day. He claimed that none of his high-level sources would talk about UFOs, which he took as powerful evidence that something tremendously important was being covered up.
This is not an attack on the Air Force spokesman or the project spokesman. They are simply following orders to explain away all UFO sightings as quickly as possible when they become public and deny that UFOs really exist.
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The explanations of those where there is a clear explanation have been made public.
He later became director of the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, where he questioned many governmental agencies about their possible involvement or knowledge of UFOs. The following is an excerpt of a letter from the FBI in answer to one of Major Kehoe's inquiries. In response to your letter of September 22, 1958, this Bureau does not have information on unidentified flying objects which can be released. This does not imply that this Bureau has information concerning unidentified flying objects which cannot be released. Possible communications with extraterrestrial vehicles from another planet, should the unidentified flying object prove to be an extraterrestrial, is not a function of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Signed, John Edgar Hoover, Director of the FBI. There are 6 distinct categories of sightings. Close encounters of the first kind refers to a mere sighting of an unidentified flying object. Close encounters of the second kind includes both the sighting of a UFO as well as tangible proof of the craft having been there, such as marks on the ground, the scorching of grass, or the interference of electrical circuits. Close encounters of the third kind is the direct confrontation with a space being or entity sometimes called a humanoid. Close encounters of the fourth kind involved alleged abductions by UFOs, where people claim to be involuntarily taken on board a UFO, usually for experimental purposes. Close encounters of the fifth kind involve contactees, or those persons who claim to be in personal contact with UFO entities, usually through metaphysical or occult means. Close encounters of the sixth kind include injuries or deaths resulting from a UFO close encounter. One of the greatest waves of UFO sightings in modern history came in 1965, with more than 500 cases reported during the summer months alone. One such case was near Ann Arbor, Michigan, where 50 people and 12 police officers in 3 counties reported having seen objects flashing across the pre-dawn skies. That evening, 87 female students at Hillsdale College near Ann Arbor watched an object flying around and flashing bright lights for a period of about 4 hours. Life magazine said, "Call them what you will, flying saucers, unidentified flying objects, or optical illusions. They are back again and seen by more people than ever before." Last week, the manifestation seemed almost to have reached the proportions of an invasion. In Washington, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford called for a full-blown investigation. Thus, the first congressional hearings on UFOs began as a closed-door session on April 5, 1966. Their conclusion was that a major university be given the job of researching the UFO phenomena. The job was given to the University of Colorado, and Edward Condon, professor of physics, would serve as chairman of the group. After much research, a 1,465-page report was completed by 36 authors at a cost of more than $500,000. The report was summed up under the section titled Conclusions and Recommendations. It states, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectations that science will be advanced thereby." On April 17, 1966, Sheriff's Deputies Dale Spower and Wilbur Neff had just investigated an accident when they noticed a glowing object about 1,000 feet above the ground in eastern Ohio. They then began pursuit at speeds of nearly 90 miles an hour. The third officer, Wayne Houston, was listening to their radio and joined the chase. 85 miles later, they pulled into a service station for refueling, where they met patrolman Frank Panzanella, who had also been tracking the UFO. The officers all stood together, watching the object hover to the east. At that point, the object shot upward at great speed and disappeared. Project Blue Book was called in to investigate. The official Air Force version was that at least 5 experienced police officers, one of them a veteran air crewman, had conducted an hours-long high-speed chase of the planet Venus. For more than 20 years, from 1948 through 1969, the United States Air Force was in charge of investigating UFO reports. The first study, established in 1948, was called Project Sign. Its conclusions were that UFOs were real and estimated them to be interplanetary craft. The Pentagon rebuked the report, calling it science fiction fantasy. The next report, called Project Grudge, was established in early 1949 and would proceed in secrecy. The critics of this investigation complained that the Air Force wanted to control all research on UFOs and that its mandate seemed to deny or explain away all sightings. Project Grudge did not last long and was officially dissolved in December of 1949. However, there had been many recent UFO sightings in New Mexico, so the Air Force launched a new study known as Project Twinkle. An observation post was set up in New Mexico and was armed with cameras, telescopes, and other optical equipment. They waited and waited, and after a year of frustration, the Air Force terminated Project Twinkle. It was not long after this that the government began a new policy of cooperation with the press by issuing regular releases about sightings and investigations. This was followed by a boom year of over 1,500 reports in 1952. The Air Force then established a task force codenamed Project Blue Book, which was to become the most systematic of all studies done by the Air Force. Witnesses received an 8-page questionnaire, photographs were analyzed, and field interviews were conducted. Investigators monitored aircraft flights and checked weather records. On the whole, the Project Blue Book team successfully weeded out UFO reports that were obvious hoaxes or those that could be attributed to natural phenomena. However, for those cases that remained unsolved, investigators had 2 choices: admit that they had failed to identify the object or embrace any remotely feasible explanation. Project Blue Book was terminated in 1969. It concluded that little, if anything, has come from the study of UFOs, and that the least likely explanation of UFOs is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitations by intelligent beings. On the evening of October 25th, 1973, a young Pennsylvania farmer, Stephen Pulaski, and at least 15 other witnesses saw a bright object hovering over a field near them. Stephen grabbed his rifle and went to investigate. It was then that he noticed something walking along by the fence. They were hairy and long-armed, with greenish-yellow eyes, and a smell like burning rubber was present. Stephen sensed that these creatures were not friendly and fired a tracer bullet over their heads. And when they kept on coming, he fired directly at one of them. The creatures then all disappeared into the woods, and the glowing object disappeared from the field instantaneously. UFO researchers as well as a state trooper were called in to investigate. When they arrived, the people there told them that Stephen had been growling like an animal and flailing his arms. His own dog ran toward him, and Stephen attacked the dog. Stephen then collapsed, and after a time began to come to his senses. The entire group commented on the nauseating, sulfur-like odor that was present. One of the earliest references to a spacecraft is probably that found in an ancient Egyptian account, some 1,500 years before Christ. One of the characteristics of that craft was the foul odor that emitted from it. The Amityville Horror was based on a factual account of what happened to a family in Amityville, New York. An irritating and nauseating odor seemed to accompany the presence of the ghost or spirit entity that entered there from time to time. Whitley Strieber wrote of his abduction experiences in his book, Communion. He said he could smell their presence and that it smelled like sulfur. On October 11th, 1973, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing when a strange craft descended and hovered near them. Parker passed out and Hickson was paralyzed, but was able to continue observing what was happening. Two entities then emerged from the craft and picked Hickson up by his arms and carried him inside the ship, where he was thoroughly examined. He was then taken back to where they had been fishing on the riverbank. When the two fishermen went to the sheriff's office to report their story, they were interrogated and then left alone in a room with a hidden microphone. The recording of their conversation revealed that both men were quite frightened by their experience. The emotional trauma had been so great to Parker that after Hickson left the room, he began to pray. Ultimately, he suffered a nervous breakdown as a result of his experience. In the spring of 1959, UFOs brought panic to Soviet radar and Air Force personnel by hovering and circling for more than 24 hours above Sverdlovsk, headquarters of a tactical missile command. Red fighter pilots were ordered airborne to chase the UFOs away, but later reported that the alien objects easily outmaneuvered their jets and zigzagged to avoid their machine gun fire. The Russian spacecraft Salyut-6 returned to Earth in 1978 after 96 days in orbit. They told of a formation of UFOs which trailed them closely for 3 complete orbits around the globe. One of their cameras captured 20 minutes of incredible motion picture footage of this encounter. According to a previous mutual agreement, the Russians forwarded copies of the film to the United States to be analyzed. Unofficial statements from NASA state that it is the best motion picture footage ever filmed of UFOs. The foremost Russian authority on UFOs, Dr. Felix Zeigel, contends that UFOs may have frightened, harassed, and possibly even killed Russian cosmonauts on their missions.
T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
On at least 6 space missions, United States astronauts have encountered UFOs. Journalist Frank Edwards records the following incident.
As Major Cooper was making his final orbit of the Earth in May of 1963, he was approaching Perth, Australia. Suddenly, Major Cooper radioed down to the tracking station that he was being approached by a greenish glowing disk with a faint red glow on one side. It was traveling east to west, which no man-made satellite does. 200 persons at the tracking station watched the object on the gear there. They saw it approach Cooper. Then it veered away from him and sped on out into space. It was only the first of many such cases. Every American astronaut since Gordon Cooper has also been approached by unidentified flying objects. And each time the UFOs come closer to the astronauts, and each time they remain a little longer. In 1965, Major Edward McDivitt photographed one of these objects near the capsule in which he was orbiting the Earth over the Pacific Ocean. And the photograph, as released by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, clearly shows a bright egg-shaped thing which leaves a visible trail from its propulsion system. The more we study the evidence that is being assembled all over the Earth, the more inescapable the conclusion that man had best prepare himself for the greatest event in human history, the realization that we are about to contact or to be contacted by sentient beings from elsewhere in the universe. The late General Douglas MacArthur said that this confrontation would be the greatest challenge man ever had to face. Are we ready for it when and if it comes? Frank Edwards reporting.
Gemini 5, 10, and 11 have all had similar encounters. So convinced was astronaut Edgar Mitchell of the existence of UFOs that he retired from the U.S. space program to devote full time to UFO investigation. During our first mission to the moon, Mission Control recorded the following broadcast of strange noises that were heard on the Apollo 11 spacecraft.
This is Apollo Control. Still no explanation. The weird noises emanating from Apollo 11, if indeed it is from Apollo 11. Perhaps we'll all shake out later in the mission as to what these strange noises are.
NASA says UFOs have reportedly dogged the U.S. space program since the very beginning. UFO researchers claim that NASA's own logs show that virtually all of the early Gemini and Apollo missions encountered UFOs. NASA has explained most of these sightings as space debris or solar flares, but some of its own astronauts have disagreed. UFO sightings have been reported by James Lovell, James McDivitt, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, Gordon Cooper, and others.
In March 1989, some strange transmissions occurred during a space flight. A Maryland ham radio operator picked up the voice of Discovery pilot Colonel John Blaha speaking on a secret NASA channel. Dr. J. Allen Hynek explains one alternative theory that we might be dealing with something from another dimension.
One of the most intriguing aspects of UFO sightings is their apparent isolation in space and time. Sightings are usually made in one place at a time and last for short periods, sometimes appearing out of nowhere and vanishing into nowhere. This is much more suggestive of a parallel reality than, let's say, visits from some faraway planet, in which case we might expect them to stick around for a while.
The British journal Flying Saucer Review was established in 1955 and is widely recognized as the leading UFO publication in the world. It is authored by over 50 experts worldwide who conduct major UFO investigations. Yet an official statement by editor Gordon Creighton is most amazing. Quote, "There seems to be no evidence yet that any of these craft or beings originate from outer space," end quote. Close encounters of the fourth kind are by far the most frightening. Those who claim to have been abducted by aliens and taken against their will. Perhaps the most famous case was that of Betty and Barney Hill. Their story began on the night of September 19th, 1961, as they were returning to their New Hampshire home from a vacation in Canada. They saw a distant point of light which seemed to move erratically. As it moved closer, it became more intense. Betty Hill remembers.
This craft left the top of the mountain, came out of the highway, and stopped in midair.
Barney took the binoculars and started out of the car in an attempt to identify the craft. And as he did this, he saw a group of figures standing in the windows looking down at him. One was saying to him, "Don't be afraid. Keep looking. Keep looking. Stay there. Don't be afraid. No harm's going to come to you, but stay there." And the craft started to descend. And Barney ran back to the car, saying we had to get out of there. They were going to capture us. And we took off speeding down the highway.
They made it home without further incident. But in the days and months that followed, they experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and extreme anxiety. They were also unable to account for more than 2 hours between the time they first encountered the UFO and the time they reached home. Where had the missing time gone? What had happened? They sought out a psychiatrist, and through hypnosis, Betty and Barney Hill narrated a tale much stranger than the one that had been lodged in their conscious minds.
Barney put on the brakes, the car motor died. They separated, came up on each side, took us out, took us in a path through the woods, took us on board, gave us physical examinations. We were being kidnapped.
Betty Hill remembers being able to offer a detailed description of her alien abductors.
They were all shot. The leader, I would say, was my height, or just a little taller than I am, and I'm 5 foot. They were bald, no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and no earlobes, no ear, we could see. Very large eyes, very small, flat nose, thin slit for men.
Betty Hill said that they were most interested in human sexuality and that they communicated through a form of telepathy that sounded like a voice loud and clear inside their heads. Bud Hopkins has written several books on UFOs, including Missing Time and Intruders. He is one of the foremost experts on abduction cases, otherwise known as close encounters of the fourth kind.
And now we've come to the conclusion that abduction, of their involvement with human beings, that this is the center of the entire UFO phenomenon, and that actually when people have UFO sightings, it's very possible that what they're seeing is something on its way to or from an abduction of somebody. They're not just flying around up there, they are interested very profoundly in human beings.
Whitley Strieber claims to have been abducted by alien beings on more than one occasion and wrote of his experiences in his best-selling book, Communion.
I've had, since I wrote Communion, over 55,000 letters from people around the world who've had this similar things that think they have happened to them, and we still get about 200 a week.
The Intruders Foundation and the Fund for UFO Research show that 1 out of every 50 American adults, 3.7 million people, indicate that they may have had an abduction experience with an unidentified flying object.
I remember my mother was taken in a Jeep, and that I was there with a UFO. There was a beam of light that came down, and I was beamed onto the ship.
These experiences sound crazy. It sounds impossible. It is impossible according to our physics, but we often use hypnosis to help flesh out all the recollections.
A top scientist, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, conducted a 5-year study of 82 persons who reported UFO experiences. Most of them were able to relive the experience through hypnosis, and all suffered severe psychological disturbances afterwards. They claimed to have been taken inside spaceships and examined by humanoids who communicated telepathic messages to them. Dave Hunt is an investigative journalist and has authored 18 books. His research and consulting expertise takes him around the world.
Cal State University, Long Beach. And again, I forget the names of the scientists there who were working on this, and this is a number of years ago now. They did research, and they took people at random. And unless you're going to say everybody's been abducted, they took people at random and who had no such idea, no indication they'd ever been abducted. And they hypnotized them, took them into a deep state, then suggested that they were being approached by a UFO, asked them to describe it. Their description was the same as the others. They suggested you're being taken aboard. Or what do the entities look like? And they came up with similar descriptions. And then when they're taken aboard, they're, what's happening to you? Well, I'm getting a medical examination, you know, or...
In his book, Secrets of the UFOs, ufologist Don Elkins made the following observation. I have found that some people can achieve the contact phenomenon simply by being hypnotized, and the same general message permeates over 90% of the millions of words received by thousands of people around the world.
No one knows what hypnosis is. No one knows what goes on in the mind. It's an altered state of consciousness like yogis and witch doctors have been practicing. It loosens the normal connection between your spirit and your brain, and of course if the hypnotist can control you, make all kinds of suggestions, make you think things are happening that are not happening, make you think you have powers that you don't, experiences that you haven't, even implant memories. Other beings, if there are other minds out there, they could also do the same thing. Sir John Eccles, Nobel Prize winner for his research on the brain, describes the brain as, quote, a machine that a ghost can operate, unquote. What he means by that is your spirit operates your brain in a normal state of consciousness. In an altered state, reached under yoga, a TM, hypnosis, you have loosened the normal connection between your spirit and your brain, and that allows another spirit, other entities, other minds to interpose themselves and begin to tick off the neurons in your brain, create a universe of illusion. I believe that it's demonic. I think all of the evidence indicates this.
I'm a hypnotherapist.
Oh, very interesting.
So I have been able to do hypnosis for many years and have naturally been able to go into a very deep trance. And I can do that on my own. And that's really how it came about. I went to a course. I was always told that I would be a trance channeler, and I went, well, okay.
Which is, I'm sorry, which is?
Okay. Someone who is able to go into a trance and to allow spirits to speak through them.
Okay.
Shortly after 7 a.m. on June the 30th, 1908, in the cold vastness of central Siberia near the Tunguska River, farmers, herdsmen, and trappers watched in awe as a round and cylindrical object, glowing with a blinding white light and a fiery tail, streaked across the morning horizon. At the time, the object was 6 to 10 kilometers above the ground, directly over a desolate region of tundra and pine forest. At 7:17, the unknown object exploded in a tremendous ball of fire, completely destroying an area of over 2,000 square kilometers, equivalent to an area larger than Los Angeles or New York City. The resulting firestorms lasted for several weeks, burning an additional 10,000 kilometers surrounding the flashpoint. This explosion could be felt several thousand kilometers away. Strangely, though, upon investigation of this location 19 years later, no impact crater of any kind was found. No one, until now, knew exactly what the object was that caused this massive explosion. Even after 90 years of investigation of this crash site by thousands of renowned expert scientists from Russia and dozens of other countries, there is still no consensus or even a loose agreement among scientists as to exactly what the object was or of its origin.
Дамы и господа, на данной картине
Recently, thousands of participants at an international space convention held in Bologna, Italy, failed to grasp any further understanding or form any unilateral scientific explanation whatsoever regarding the phenomenon. Professor N.V. Vasilev, chairman of the Scientific Organizing Committee of the Russian Academy of Sciences, admitted during this convention that it was most remarkable that the explosion was of a non-terrestrial object of still unknown origin, and that an unambiguous comprehensive solution has still not been achieved to address all of the problems involved in a logical scientific explanation.
A group of scientists found the impact point, and they found something very interesting, namely a forest that for many square miles had been knocked down, and all the trees were pointing radially away from the impact point. And at the impact point was a great big hole in the ground. Now, what's interesting about it is nothing was found of whatever caused the impact. There is the forest torn down, there's the great big hole, and nothing else.
Interestingly, the cumulative available evidence both supports and contradicts all of the explanations previously put forward to account for the explosion. Conflicting evidence supports many of the competing proposals, ranging from that of an asteroid, a comet, antimatter particles, contact with a mini black hole, and even a futuristic weapon discharge. Furthermore, some evidence that was apparently collected several years ago by Russian scientists had been confiscated and concealed by the Ministry of State Security, later to be known as the KGB, without a trace or an explanation. This program presents, for the first time, an account of this mysterious explosion by one of the last surviving eyewitnesses, and furthermore exposes the fallacies in the current scientific theories and explanations put forth to interpret what actually happened in Tunguska on that fateful morning in 1908. A colonel in the former Soviet Union's KGB now admits to being an accessory to a covert Russian cover-up to suppress and conceal crucial evidence. He further explains his role in the government scheme to conceal the conclusions reached by many Russian scientists as to the actual true nature of this explosion. That being that Tunguska actually bears the scars of an authentic 90-year-old crash site of an interplanetary spaceship of extraterrestrial origin. The role of the Russian government in attempting to conceal the truth about this event, as well as the virtual impossibility of explaining this event by any known natural means, seems almost identical to the event that occurred in 1947 in the United States near Roswell, New Mexico. And with all the evidence considered, Tunguska may very well represent the Russian Roswell. Just prior to the Tunguska explosion in 1908, observatories and meteorologists around the world noted a series of atmospheric oddities, such as the formation and movement of unusual clouds, as well as an unusually strong aurora borealis and solar halos, among many others. No one was able to directly connect these atmospheric oddities with the Tunguska object. However, the coincidences in time between the sudden occurrence of the strange atmospheric activity followed by the explosion strongly suggests that they must have been connected in some way.
I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time I saw it with my father. We were farming in a little village near the railroad tracks. And I'll never forget how it looked like a long, round chimney on its side with a long tail of fire. I remember telling everybody I could that it looked at first like it was coming down, but then angled up for a little while, and then I was absolutely positive that it had changed its direction.
As many as 900 eyewitnesses living near the crash site gave similar accounts shortly after the explosion. Collectively, their stories made the trajectory difficult to explain in a logical scientific manner, since it indicated a maneuvering object. Physically, it is impossible for a meteor or comet to fall through the Earth's atmosphere, being pulled by gravity, then change direction. Whatever the phenomenon may have been, it did not behave like any naturally occurring object.
It disappeared over the next mountain ridge. And I remember like it was yesterday, how a few seconds later it seemed like the entire world had ended. There was a flash that filled the entire sky, and it was like the sky opened up and split in half. I put my hands over my eyes and I could see the bones in my hands.
In modern terms, the blast was equivalent to 40 megatons, approximately the size of the largest thermonuclear bomb. The explosion was so massive, it was over 2,000 times the explosive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Given the remoteness of the area, the onset of World War I, and the internal conflicts within Russia, which resulted in the Communist Revolution, it wasn't until 1927 that an expedition was mounted to investigate the crash site. Upon arrival at the site, the members of this expedition were awestruck to witness the carnage and extent of the devastation that still existed 19 years after the event. Trees the size of telephone poles were snapped like toothpicks. The fallen trees were arranged in a radial pattern away from a central point, like the spokes of a bicycle wheel. There was no crater and no trace of a large meteorite found anywhere. There were, however, many small pieces of metallic fragments embedded in the felled trees which were collected for analysis. In addition, many people living near the explosion site were reported to have died of an unknown illness, showing symptoms not previously documented in that region.
I could not get over the fact that so many of my friends and family were getting sick, and many of them died when still young. They were healthy before, and I just could not figure out why they got sick and died.
Another occurrence that could not be explained by any natural means at that time was when the observatory, located 900 kilometers away in Irkutsk, Siberia, recorded very unusual disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field at the time of the explosion, as well as severe magnetic storms occurring just after the explosion. Satisfactory explanations for both the explosion and the resulting abnormalities were impossible until after World War II. Following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, aerial photographs of these cities were compared with aerial photographs of the Tunguska crash site. They were surprisingly and stunningly similar, with the notable exception that the Tunguska site was tremendously larger by comparison. In addition, people living near the two bomb blasts in Japan exhibited identical symptoms to those from Tunguska. Many experts came to believe that the people who died of the strange illness near Tunguska did so as a result of radiation poisoning.
Stalin узнал о случившемся между Тунгусской и Хиросима.
When Stalin found out about the similarities between Tunguska and Hiroshima,
once the Russians acquired the technology to explode thermonuclear weapons, they conducted numerous experiments and test detonations high in the atmosphere. They found that such explosions in the atmosphere had the effect of disrupting the Earth's magnetic field, causing geomagnetic storms, seemingly identical to those of the Irkutsk readings of the Tunguska explosion of 1908. Further evidence of a nuclear blast and residual radiation debris fallout was revealed some years later, when Russian scientists and experts found that virtually all of the trees at Tunguska underwent an abnormal accelerated growth rate for several years subsequent to the blast. This was determined to be the result of genetic mutations caused by radiation exposure. Korolev himself supported and equipped an expedition to investigate the explosion at Tunguska. By the late 1950s, a number of expeditions confirmed finding residual traces of radiation throughout the entire blast region. Based on the lack of any unambiguous evidence to explain this event by any natural means, Korolev concluded that the blast had been caused by the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle. On October 4th, 1959, over 51 years after the Tunguska explosion, the event earned a belated spot on the front page of the New York Times. Russian scientists were reporting the discovery of radiation at the site, as well as the conflicting evidence found to explain the explosion by any natural means. Their collective conclusion was that the event was a nuclear explosion caused by an object of extraterrestrial origin.
Once radiation traces were found out there, my superiors instructed a team of us to lock down the whole place and to take possession of all objects that were ever collected from the site. We told all of the people there who saw the object years ago to say that it was only a big meteor. Otherwise, they would get a free ticket to a Siberian prison camp. We thought for sure that we would find some alien body parts, or spacecraft chunks, or nuclear bomb parts. And the last thing we wanted to do was to share any findings with the Americans.
Soon afterward, many of the scientists involved in this investigation lost their jobs or were invited by the KGB to a long-term expedition deep in Siberia. TASS, the Soviet government-controlled newspaper media, did an about-face and changed their official story in stating that the explosion wasn't a UFO after all, but simply must have been a comet or an asteroid.
We did collect some papers and samples of odd-shaped metal and rock pieces, but I never did find out whatever happened to any of that, or whether or not anyone else found out about what the story was. All I was told to do was to have people not say that it was a UFO. We had all of the materials sent to a secret military base just south of Vanovara in Siberia, but I don't know what happened to it since then.
For over 3 generations, the Russians have successfully kept the truth from the world about this event. As a result, scientists and experts have been spinning their wheels attempting to explain the Tunguska explosion and crash site by natural means. The most popular of these explanations put forth for this event is that it was caused by either a small asteroid or comet. Both comets and asteroids are essentially the leftover debris from the birth of our solar system over 4.5 billion years ago, when the sun and planets formed from a ball of dust that remained after the explosion of a star.
There's another population whose existence was only discovered about 65 years ago. That's the Earth-crossing asteroid population. The population of Earth-crossing asteroids constitute a giant swarm of objects, which may be as numerous almost as the main asteroid belt. It's just that we haven't discovered very many of them. It's just an enormous population. You have tens of millions, maybe 100 million, which are larger than a small house. Just a huge swarm. Every once in a very long while, they can collide with our planet. The asteroid collision hazard is real.
As a result of the overlapping orbits of these Earth-crossing asteroids, tens of thousands of collisions have occurred throughout the course of Earth's history. One of the explanations offered by scientists is that an asteroid about the size of a 25-story building, comprised of a loose conglomeration of small rocks and minerals, entered the atmosphere on a collision course with the Earth. However, due to friction, the object heated up to several thousand degrees and came apart, exploding and disintegrating in a huge ball of fire. While it is altogether possible that a rock weighing about 1 million tons could create such explosive power and leave some radioactive traces, there are numerous problems and evidentiary contradictions that thwart this conclusion, even though that this explanation is the cleanest and simplest one to accept. Normally, when an asteroid enters the Earth's atmosphere, it would heat up to incredible temperatures. And if small, it would explode very high in the atmosphere. Or if large, it would slam into the Earth, dredging up billions of tons of soil and rock.
Perhaps the best known example is Meteor Crater in Arizona. That was made by an impact of an iron object about 100 feet across. And it exploded with an energy that we could estimate from the crater itself as about 15 megatons, about the size of the largest nuclear bombs. It left a scar. It's 50,000 years old, and there are half a dozen other craters on the Earth of similar age that are also easily seen.
Virtually all of the other impact traces endured by the Earth are erased almost as quickly as they appear, such that all impacts, except the most recent, go unnoticed.
Any object larger than about 50 feet across, with an explosive energy then of the order of several megatons, equivalent to a large nuclear bomb, is able to penetrate through our atmosphere and to explode either in the lower atmosphere or at the surface. So when one of those penetrations takes place, we end up with the equivalent of a large nuclear bomb going off, which of course could do terrible damage.
It is almost inconceivable that an object the size of a 25-story building and weighing over 1 million tons would disintegrate into dust particles without leaving any debris of some sort. The Arizona crater was caused by a meteor that had to be only 1/4 the size of the one that caused the Tunguska explosion. And that one made it to the surface intact, which adds to the dubious nature of this explanation. Furthermore, a meteor would not be able to change course as many of the eyewitnesses claimed, nor would it be able to create the atmospheric oddities associated with the object. A relatively small meteor made up of a loose collection of rocks could not have disrupted the magnetic field or created geomagnetic storms as did the object in question.
Recently, the suggestion was made that it was actually a chunk of a comet that smashed into the Earth. And in fact, it never really hit the ground, but it blew up a mile or so above the surface. And that is exactly what you would expect of something frail, like a great big chunk of ice like that.
Comets are made of ice and rock. Their spectacular tails occur when the solar wind evaporates bits of ice and dust, and then blowing these particles back for millions of kilometers. Scientists believe there are trillions of comets beyond the furthest planet in a formation known as the Oort cloud, and that comets are periodically dislodged from their distant orbits and hurled towards the sun. Most comets make only one pass through the inner solar system during their lifetime. The comet explanation does account for the atmospheric oddities in that some of the material coming off of the comet tail could have reacted with the upper atmosphere prior to the entry and explosion. As with the asteroid or meteor impact theory, the comet theory also has numerous problems and contradictory evidence that tends to reject this explanation as well. Comets are defined by their brightness and long tails, so it is difficult to believe that a comet could sneak up on the Earth without any prior sightings from anywhere else on Earth. A comet consisting mainly of ice would not have been able to cause the geomagnetic storm or leave such radiation or be able to change course for that matter. Furthermore, comets are not known to contain radioactive material. Computer simulations clearly show that a comet of the size required to create such a blast would have disintegrated much higher in the atmosphere than the object that exploded over Tunguska. One of the more exotic explanations for the explosion is that particles of antimatter were formed over the Tunguska region and exploded when they came in contact with the molecules in the atmosphere. It It has been well documented in the scientific community that when antimatter particles come in contact with positive matter particles, they cancel each other out and can create a massive explosion. This proposal is based on the residual radiation left over after the explosion, the lack of a crater, and the lack of an observation of a mushroom cloud. This explanation, however, does not at all account for the atmospheric and geomagnetic oddities associated with the Tunguska explosion or the eyewitness observations of an object streaking across the sky, not to mention the lack of any rational explanation for where and how these antimatter particles formed over the region. These particles would doubtlessly have come into contact with the atmosphere much higher than the explosion. Hence, these inconsistencies and contradictory evidence clearly dismiss this theory as a possible explanation. One of the least likely natural phenomena proposed to cause this explosion was the possibility that a mini black hole came into contact with Tunguska. Black holes are tremendously dense objects, such that a mass the size of the Earth could fit into a space the size of a tennis ball, and have the gravitational pull so strong as to affect even light waves. Since the gravitational forces and mass required to create a black hole would be so enormous, it is virtually impossible to get a pin-sized black hole, and any black hole that might theoretically be bigger and come close to Earth would most certainly have catastrophic effects on the entire planet. Therefore, this explanation can also be dismissed as having no relevant merits. Since the available evidence is contradictory and therefore rejecting the meteor or comet theory of origin, as well as other naturally occurring phenomena, some experts have proposed man-made causes for the explosion. Among the most publicized explanations is the theory that the explosion was caused by a high-energy electrical beam originating from the laboratory of Nikola Tesla in New York, and that he created the beam as a demonstration for Admiral Byrd at the North Pole. Apparently, according to this theory, Tesla overshot the mark and caused the Tunguska explosion. The national network broadcast TV program Sight presented this explanation as the one and only means by which this explosion could have occurred. This theory is absolutely ludicrous and has very little merit at all. First, there were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw an object hurtle through the upper atmosphere and then explode. Secondly, even our present-day technology cannot create the electrical energy required to mimic a thermonuclear blast of 40 megatons and completely destroy 2,000 square kilometers, not to mention projecting that amount of energy halfway around the world. Even if so great an electrical discharge could be generated, sending it into and through the fragile ionosphere would have ripped away and ionized half the planet's upper atmosphere and would have killed off all life on Earth. Furthermore, the pattern of tree destruction at Tunguska clearly indicates that it was a gigantic high-altitude explosion rather than an electrical discharge. In addition, the electrical discharge would not have left long-term radiation at the site. Therefore, the Tesla weapon electrical energy discharge theory is also highly suspect and tremendously inconsistent with the available evidence. Of all the explanations previously proposed for this explosion, the only viable explanation for all of these variables, as well as accounting for the Russian government's cover-up, is that the Tunguska explosion was not natural in origin. As shocking as it may seem, it is now proposed that this event was the result of exploding nuclear or ion-powered engines belonging to an interplanetary spacecraft. The eyewitness account of an object descending, then angling upward slightly, can be explained by NASA's own studied spacecraft re-entering into the Earth's atmosphere. Re-entry can only be accomplished if done within a 2-degree angle of descent. If the spacecraft enters at too steep an angle, it disintegrates high in the atmosphere as a result of heat caused by friction. If the angle of re-entry is too shallow, the spacecraft descends, but goes back up and out of the atmosphere, much like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. It is hypothesized that the spacecraft entered the atmosphere at too shallow an angle and was skipping out of the Earth's atmosphere when it attempted to change course but then exploded as a result of overheating and stress on the spacecraft. The explosion itself and the associated evidence is not at all consistent with a meteor or comet chemical explosion, but is consistent with a 40 megaton thermonuclear blast about 6 to 10 kilometers up in the atmosphere. The residual radiation, people dying of radiation poisoning, the abnormal accelerated growth of the trees as a result of genetic mutation, the geomagnetic disturbances, lack of an impact crater, the lack of any meteor fragments or comet debris, the suppressed collection of metallic fragments, and all other evidence concerning this crash site leaves only one theory intact. That is, the event occurring in Tunguska in 1908 was the result of an explosion of the nuclear or ion-powered engines of an interplanetary spacecraft. As early as the late 1960s, NASA had designed and test-fired nuclear engines for 21st century spacecraft, and continues to research the viability of nuclear-powered and ion-powered engines for interplanetary and interstellar travel. These engines would have to contain at least as much material on board which could conceivably cause a similar-sized detonation as that observed over Tunguska.
Well, NASA's been involved in the development of ion propulsion for over 30 years now, and very early they were able to demonstrate good engine performance. But because these engines have such low thrust levels compared to chemical rockets, very, very long burn times are required for typical planetary missions, on the order of 8,000 to 12,000 hours. So the hardest part of working with ion propulsion is demonstrating that the engine has enough lifetime for those kinds of missions.
The design and concept for such a spacecraft is not at all science fiction. In fact, it will be the design of our own human expedition spaceships in the next 100 years or so. Small-scale early versions are already being built for unmanned probes that will reach the outer limits of our solar system and beyond.
The NSTAR thruster will be used first on the first New Millennium mission, which is a comet and asteroid flyby. Subsequent missions in which it might be used would be small body rendezvous missions or perhaps outer planet missions.
In 1947, the United States government began a massive cover-up of an alien crash site at Roswell, New Mexico, and has for over 50 years continued its conspiracy to hide the truth from the American people. The reports of the U.S. military concealing both a recovered interplanetary spacecraft and alien occupants have made the Roswell crash site by far the most famous example of humanity's contact with extraterrestrial life and government cover-up. The Tunguska crash predates Roswell by nearly 4 decades. But even though no spacecraft or alien occupants were recovered, the suppression of facts and confiscation of materials collected from the site by the KGB, in addition to the discrediting of eyewitness accounts, bear striking similarities to the U.S. cover-up of the crash site at Roswell. It is only now, after the collapse of communism and breakup of the Soviet Union, as well as the warming relationship between the former Eastern and Western Bloc countries, that the true eyewitness accounts of the Tunguska explosion and subsequent cover-up are beginning to surface. It is hoped that the further warming of relationships between Russian and American politicians and scientists may ultimately allow for a release and an analysis of the confiscated metallic materials
Thank you.
still hidden
I'm
at
very
the Siberian
proud to
military base.
I've been invited to talk on such an important...
In light of this newly revealed evidence and the rejection of all natural explanations for this phenomenon, the crash site at Tunguska could very well represent the most significant and historic, yet the most overlooked and almost forgotten discovery in the history of humanity.
Out of nowhere, flying saucer mystery is with us.
Airline and Air Force pilots. The Air Force itself has officially admitted that flying saucers exist.
Is there another civilization somewhere? Are we under surveillance by an intelligence that has revealed itself to us?
Hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
Is life everywhere the same as us? Or are we just one example of a vast array of possible kinds of biochemistry?
The paradigm science is not equipped to handle this.
Identified flying objects.
Believing in them is a matter of communicating with them. Very strange and unusual.
Economic reasons, political reasons, military reasons. It's not a scientific issue.
It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle, but it's a puzzle that's worth exploring.
Our Earth has been observed by alien civilizations for at least the past 50 years. Throughout our history, each age in our development is characterized by an ignorance about the scope of possibilities not yet understood, that future generations may look back on with a sympathetic smile of condescension.
To us, in the 20th century Earth, this might seem magical, but I tell people to maintain some sense, if they can, please ask them, to maintain some sense of humility. Because if you were to show this video camera, or a hologram, or a laser to someone only 300 Earth years ago, it would appear to be a magic. It would be considered supernatural.
Such is the case with UFOs. To us, they represent intangible illusions between fantasy and reality. "400 years ago, the Earth was believed to be the physical center of the universe. Nicholas Copernicus, and later Galileo, challenged that belief, suggesting that the sun was the center. And still 200 years would pass before William Herschel's stellar observations, and later Edwin Hubble's classification of galaxies, relegated our sun to a single, insignificant star among billions. Only then do we begin to imagine our place in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos."
I think there is a certain twilight zone of phenomena that, if confirmed, would really overthrow the entire materialistic worldview.
Let me just say, as a professor of philosophy who's writes professional articles and knows how to do academic research, there is in this field some incredibly good literature, very sophisticated material.
There's just a wealth of information, and I would challenge anybody to disprove that. You see, anyone who says there's no evidence to study has not looked. It's as simple as that.
The possibility of a purely psychological explanation is ruled out. The discs do not behave in accordance with physical laws, but as though they were weightless, and show signs of intelligent guidance, such as would suggest quasi-human pilots. The officials in possession of authoritative information should not hesitate to enlighten the public as speedily and thoroughly as possible. Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, 1954.
It's just more than, UFO crashes and alien bodies. I mean, there's a whole science here. And they're called Dr. Hynek. He said, the UFOs, whatever they represent the science of the 21st century. Right now, we don't have the technology or the know-how to explain what they are and how they do it.
Crop circle formations continue to appear on several continents.
This is the beginning, a doorway opening to a new science, a new physics, a new energy, a new world. I think very much that's where this is all moving.
Thousands of credible sightings continue to persist.
The subject of UFOs is part of the subject matter of some courses that I teach. Okay. So it's got academic credibility in the community. Yeah. At least as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is really overwhelming that extraterrestrials are here. It's hard, after you see 5 weeks of that material, it's really hard not to have that opinion, I think.
Abduction accounts from around the world, beginning in the 60s with the Hill case, recall exact similarities and also continue to persist.
The problem here is in a way, it's the messenger. Here I am, a historian at Temple University, here Bud's an artist at Hopkins, and there's Mike Swords, who's at Western Michigan University, and all that. Now, various people saying these things, that this might be happening, well, the fact that we are saying it automatically means it can't be happening, because the message is far too big for the messenger. If this were truly happening, we would not be the messengers. The President of the United States, the Secretary General of the United Nations, they would be the messengers, and that would mean it wouldn't be happening. So no matter how much we say it, and no matter how much abductees say it, that automatically means it can't be happening.
The UFO phenomenon has been a part of our lives for the past 50 years. With it comes the possibility that we may finally discover who we are and what we humans might accomplish in a vast cosmos, endowed with intelligence.
What I always state about this phenomenon is that taken together, the collection of all the photographs, the videotapes, the accounts that I've been mentioning, the ground traces, the physical marks on people's bodies, the descriptions of the events in the craft, and et cetera, the sighting, all of that constitutes an extraordinary phenomenon. And I think it is indisputable that an extraordinary phenomenon demands an extraordinary investigation.
To continue to dismiss the UFO phenomenon may very well be ignoring the most profound occurrences of our times. In our struggle to achieve technological dominance of the physical world, we have endangered not only ourselves, but countless other living forms. And in the process, we seem to have lost a profound sense of our place in the cosmos.
The paradigm of science is not equipped to handle this phenomenon. Sociological reasons, threat, denial, psychological reasons, economic reasons, political reasons, military reasons. It's not a scientific issue.
So there's a lot that scientific method, as we know, can do to study this phenomenon. But what it cannot do is try to explain the meaning of it or the purpose of it. This must be left to another type of reflection.
For the last few years, it's been thinking a lot more about what's happening on this planet and seeing that the evolution of human consciousness has reached a crisis point, which goes along with the time when we have the potential to step out and start exploring the stars. That's the challenge where we're really facing at the moment. We've become masters of the material world, and technology is really, technology is tools, and we've got the most incredible tools now to do almost anything we want in the material world, including stepping off this planet into space. But I think what we've got to become is equal masters of our minds, and that's the next frontier, is inner space. We've got to stop being victims of our fears and all the stuff that's inside us. We've got to actually become masters of ourselves. move beyond this egocentric phase so that we can then become the true masters of our technology and use that with wisdom for the good of ourselves, the good of the planet, the good of the cosmos.
The stories piqued my curiosity, and I began first collecting news clips from the local papers, which published little short news items on them, occasionally. And then I started looking for pictures, and I clipped a few of them out of newspapers and magazines until I ran into somebody that had an actual print. And I went to a lot of trouble negotiating with him to get a copy of that. But once I had one original print, it was easy enough to trade that to the next man and in return for his. And then I had 2 to trade, and then 4 to trade, and the collection grew rapidly when I had something somebody else wanted. And I just kept trading the same pictures over and over to others who had different pictures, and eventually everything that was out there came my direction, and I put it in the file. So at the present time, I think there's over 4,000 pictures in the files, and they're all different pictures, but it's purged, pretty well purged. I don't have any in there that I know are fakes or have strong reason to believe are fakes.
Colonel Stevens began his career in the Air Force as a young fighter pilot during World War II in the Pacific. An expert in the field of aircraft technology, after the war he was stationed with the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright Field. During his 24-year career, Colonel Stevens played a role in the negotiations which led to the Japanese surrender and served as a consultant to the Bolivian Air Force in its structural formation. Retired from service in 1963, Wendell Stevens has since earned an international reputation as one of the world's foremost UFO investigators, having published well over 20 books on the subject. His interest in the phenomenon was established in 1947 when he was transferred to Alaska and placed in charge of B-29 crews flying missions over the Arctic.
When I got to Alaska, I found that my additional duty, I was assigned there as an assistant base operations officer, completely out of my specialty. My specialty was technical engineering. As an assistant base operations officer, and my additional duty was supervising a team of civilian technicians from Wright Field, where I had just come out of, that were installing special equipment aboard the B-29s that were flying their target profiles are over all the B-29 crews had their targets in Russia, and they carried them home with them. They had them with them all the time so they could get on an airplane in 5 minutes and have the targets with them. They were required to fly a profile mission on their targets over the Arctic in Arctic airspace and their Arctic conditions at least once, and every crew was rotated through Alaska to do this. My team was installing special equipment to look for anomalous aerial phenomena, is what the Russians were calling it. We were calling them flying saucers. We were looking for surges in the electrical system. We installed surge detectors in every system on a B-29. There's 5 or 6 different electrical systems. We installed magnetic detectors in the lines. We installed cameras in positions that didn't have, all the gun positions on the B-29 already had 60mm cameras in them. But we installed other cameras that looked forward and looked aft. We had handheld cameras. We had even 35mm movie cameras and a big 70mm movie camera that could be used. And they also had a Fairchild 8x10 camera that was a big thing like this. It took a picture on an 8-inch by 10-inch negative. So all of that stuff was carried aboard the airplane, and after the operation people briefed the crews, then after the weather people briefed the crews, then the Coast and Geodetic Survey people briefed the crews, then I had to brief the crews on the equipment that my team had put aboard and how to use it and what it was for. And if they got anything when they came back, they were debriefed in the same order, and if they had experienced anything, they'd be turned over to me last, and they'd tell me what they experienced one by one. And while they were doing that, my crews would be downloading the cartridges, cassettes, and film cans, and all of those things we had. And if they had had an experience of any kind, that was unique and important. The data would all be boxed in a metal box looked like a little foot locker, about that long and about that wide and about that high. And that was padlocked on a lieutenant's wrist and flown out to Washington every night on a courier. And he had to go to a certain office that had a key to take it off to unlock him and turn him loose. And they kept the box and sent it back on the next courier flight. We had several of those. And this was how the data was transmitted to Washington. We never had no way to read it. We couldn't develop that. We could, but they weren't allowed to develop the film, to read the tapes, to look at the movie camera film, nothing.
So you would hear the stories?
Well, we'd hear the stories that resulted from the action that was on the film, but we never got to see any of it. So there were some real interesting stories about seeing objects sitting on the water, submerge and disappear as the B-29 came along. Other times they'd take off and fly away. Once was seen to come to the surface and emerge and fly away. They saw them take off from the ice surface of the ice pack up there, the snowfield. And these are big objects, 100 feet in diameter, that have no ground support equipment. You know, to get a B-29 airborne in the Arctic in the wintertime, it takes a field of equipment around the B-29 as big as the B-29. Well, here were bigger craft sitting on the snow up there with no ground support equipment that take off and fly away at high speed. And that puzzled our senior leaders a good deal, because they wanted to believe that it was a Russian innovation that had come out of the war, that they didn't want to accept the idea that it might be extraterrestrial. In fact, I was almost alone in that idea. Most of the time, I'd tell my boss that I thought they were extraterrestrial beings, and he'd laugh and he'd say, they can't come here from there and go back. Why would they come? Because cosmic distances are too vast, you know. If it's going to take you 50 years to get someplace and 50 years to get home, who's going? Among the first photographs taken on the old tin-type cameras was one at Drobak, Norway, showing a photographer with the big bellows over his head and a big camera on a tripod was taking a scene of the harbor. And after late afternoon scene of the harbor, early evening, and he saw an object moving from right to left across the field of view, snapped a picture of it, and got perhaps the first photograph of a UFO at close range in Earth's atmosphere in the sky here. And that picture was taken on the 27th of July of 1907 at Drobak, Norway. The next picture of importance, and probably the second or third picture of UFOs taken, was photographed by Mr. Alfredo Fendricas, a weekly news magazine reporter for a paper in Fatima, in Portugal. And you know, the apparitions began in September, in August, 13th of August, 13th of September, and the 13th of October. In the first apparition, the children saw the sun swooping overhead, and an apparition appeared, and to 3 shepherd children, they reported that to their priest. The priest went with them the next time. The apparition happened, only the 4 people saw it. They got the word that it was going to happen a third time on the 13th of October. Now, all this is predicted in advance. And by the time of the third anticipated apparition on the 13th of October, there were 12,000 people gathered in the fields there. When the object appeared, it was brilliant, came through saw a spot, and it emerged through the underside of the clouds. It was rotating on a vertical axis, began to swoop over the heads of the crowd like this, making low passes back and forth over the crowd. Alfredo Fendricas got 2 pictures with his camera of the object in the sky. We have one of them here. It shows up as a brilliant ball of light below the clouds. It's a tin type, so it's not the sharpest picture of all. Then the next pictures of consequence were the pictures taken during the Japanese invasion of China and their Manchurian operation. They used aircraft, and objects appeared over the flight line of the Japanese bombers preparing for missions. They appeared following the bomber formations in flight. They appeared in the sky above formations. They even passed through formations, much like the Foo Fighters of modern history, modern war history, except they were something else then. And it was during that time, during the Manchurian occupation, that a Chinese or a Japanese general in the occupation forces was walking down the street in Tianjin, China, and his attention was drawn to an object in the sky because the street photographer, one of those with the old bellows camera, had it set up, and people started pointing and shouting and pointing to the object in the sky. Rickshaws stopped, crowds stopped, people pointed. The tin-type cameraman aimed his camera and took one picture of the object coming down the street. The Japanese general went over and bought it and took it back to Japan. And that's the photograph made in 1942 at Tianjin, China, in the middle, full day, daylight. The next one of any serious importance was one that was made over Los Angeles on the 24th, the night of the 24th to 25th of February, 1942. And this was after our war with Japan had started, and we had our cities in blackout at the time. Los Angeles was blacked out every night. San Francisco, San Diego, the whole west coast of the United States. And at early in the morning, like 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, disc-shaped objects appeared over the city. And the anti-aircraft batteries turned on the searchlights. The objects passed back and forth through the searchlights, some dozen objects in the sky. They started, anti-aircraft batteries started firing on them, and they fired, golly, they fired 1,430 rounds, anti-aircraft rounds of ammunition. Didn't hit a thing that night. They killed a few people. The falling metal from the anti-aircraft shells killed people, dogs, set houses afire, did a lot of damage, but didn't hurt any, didn't bring down any alien craft. The next one of serious importance, again, was before, well, it was after Kenneth Arnold described flying saucers here. That was in 1949. But the next photo event of interest happened on the 17th of March in 1950 at Farmington, New Mexico, when on that day, Mr. Walter Rogel, managing editor of the Farmington Times, published news on the front page of his paper, "Huge saucer armada jolts Farmington." Now what happened on that day, the town's population of about 5,000 people then, looked up and saw spaceships, circular, disc-shaped, metallic disc-shaped craft with domes on the top, passing over their city. They were changing position within the formation like a flock of bees or birds. They did not maintain a regular established formation. It was just a large gaggle of objects that flew over. Hundreds of them flew over for almost 2 hours, and the same thing happened the following day. One picture escaped collection by the military people that went there and canvassed the houses. They took all the pictures, took cameras, but somebody had in town, left town after taking the photographs and took one to Durango, Colorado, where he turned it into the Durango paper, and Durango published this one photograph. Shows about 7 or 8 of the objects in the sky, 5 of them in a loose formation at lower level, and 4 or 5 at higher levels beyond it. A bird watcher walking in the woods on the 23rd of April, 1950, was crashing through the underbrush, and he emerged into a clear area not far from Redbud, Illinois, facing the southwest. He came into a clearing from the south side, and as he stepped into the open area, he saw a large object hovering just over the scrub bushes there. Now, this was about 30 or 40 feet in diameter, and it was less than 100 feet high. It was below the tops of the trees. And as he stepped into the clearing there, it started to move, slowly at first, and then faster and faster. He had time to open his reflex camera, where you look in the top, and they're hard to sight in because the scene moves the opposite direction once you move the camera. And he got it open and got one picture, and by the time he could roll the film and get set up again, it had moved so far away, he was afraid he wouldn't get it. He snapped the picture he got a little dark spot in the sky, but it was not very definitive. It was just a dark smudge leaving. The first picture was a good, sharp, clear picture. And he turned it over to the local newspaper, and it was published on the paper. And a few days later, he was contacted by a newsboy who was throwing papers that time of day down the road in a rural area. And the newsboy said that he saw the object coming from the direction of the woods, heading down the highway at about 4 times, 5 times the speed of an airplane. And he looked up at it and saw it, and down the road a little ways, he came on a man and his wife working on the roof repairing it, and he said, "Did you see the thing that just went over?" And they said yes, they had watched it also. So there were other observers that corroborated Dean Morgan's story, and they came out in news reports the following day. So that was an interesting sighting because it represented a type seen rather close up and photographed within 100, 150 feet, 200 feet of the camera. The next one that got any real attention occurred on the 11th of May of 1952 at McMinnville, Oregon, at about 7:30 in the early evening of 11 May 1952. Farmer Paul Trent was in the kitchen of his home when he heard his wife, who called to him from the backyard to come out and see the strange object that was approaching. And he immediately ran for his folding camera and dashed outside to meet her. There against the low overcast sky, he saw a circular dome disc with a tower on top of the dome, a raised cupola. And it was moving fairly slow. He had plenty of time to frame it. He snapped the first picture, and then he had to move to his right to snap the second picture. There was no flame or efflux of any kind visible, no sound. It was completely silent. His wife didn't hear any sounds either. The pictures he took on the 11th of May, and he didn't report them until the 12th of June, when he had his pictures developed and back, and he showed them to a friend, Frank Wortman, who suggested they take him to the newspaper, and they took him to the Richmond, California Independent, where they looked at them, tested them, and published them for the first time. So now that it's 2 months after the pictures were taken before the information got out. But they have become a classic in the lore of ufology, I guess if you want to call it now. And they've been verified by a number of researchers.
My hypothesis is that these people who are driving these UFOs, or at least the people who designed them, have a technology that's more advanced than ours. I mean, I think that's obvious, that they're more advanced than our technology. Their technology is so advanced that they have figured out a way to artificially warp space-time the way a black hole does, only without all the gravitational effects that rip things apart into their constituent atoms. So that they can actually manipulate. They have some sort of a generator in here so that they can actually produce this field around their craft like a little bubble, a little private universe that they carry around with them, so that they can actually step out of normal space-time into their own private universe and then step back into it at other coordinates. So if that's possible, then they can not only come from all these distant places, but they can also come from parallel universes that coexist with ours and we're not able to see because they're on a different vibrational level or whatever. They can even come, probably, from our own past or our own future. Because as the quantum physicists are telling us now, the past, present, and future are not separate. Our idea of the stream of time is only an artifact of our consciousness. It is our consciousness that's traveling. It isn't that things are happening cause and effect in a linear fashion. It is our consciousness that's doing that. So the past and future actually exist simultaneously with us, and if you're able to warp space-time, you can travel to and from them. Time is not linear. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's just a concept that we use to describe aspects of space-time, and it's an artifact of our consciousness. So this warping of space-time, I think, can explain a great many things about the UFOs.
Some remarkable UFO photographs from the early 1950s were taken by George Adamski through his 6-inch telescope near Mount Palomar, California. In many respects, Mr. Adamski can be considered a pioneer in this field, also claiming to have been in contact with the occupants of the craft.
I consider myself extremely fortunate because really, from a very young age, I had the opportunity to be in an environment where this type of information, this field of UFOs, was really in an amazing time. I mean, the news was covering it as much as they possibly could. Scientists were exploring. We were coming in the space program. So space was on everyone's mind. And during those 63 to 65, which we were involved with Mr. Adamski personally during those times, we really had an opportunity, I really had an opportunity to see some of these crafts exceedingly close. And these are impressions that never leave my thinking because they were so deeply rooted. And to go to these lectures in which you had literally lines of scientists and military officials sitting there and people listening intently on the information that was exchanged and given, it was a very dynamic time in this field, which certainly has changed in the last 20 years. My father had numerous sightings, and due to these sightings, he got in contact with many different agencies of the government and investigated heavily into others who had reports of UFO encounters and taken pictures of these type of craft. And because of this investigation, he got in contact with Mr. George Adamski, who was in many respects a pioneer in this field already back into the late 40s and early 50s. I've been taking a large number of telescopic pictures and had motion picture footage of these crafts and even had many controversial contacts during these times. And this is really the basis of how I became involved through my lifetime, through my father and through Mr. George Adamski. George Adamski was originally a student and involved with philosophical teaching. And it was due to his study of philosophy that led him to the conclusions that life and the principles of nature and life around us were not by any means a manifestation of only the environment around us. Basically that creation and life was universal. And it was this recognition that led him to investigate through telescopic means, looking out into space and at the moon to see if he could find evidence of this expression of life. And he was able to, through lunar photography, take some of the very first pictures of spacecraft orbiting the moon and traveling in the Earth's atmosphere already in the late 1940s. Historically, the first analysis, I would say, began with Leonard Cramp, who did orthographic projections on the Adamski pictures. He did comparison analysis on the Adamski scout craft with the Coniston pictures taken by two young teenagers in England several years after he took his photographs, and then also with a Brazilian shot that was taken in late 1954. And based on this orthographic analysis, Dr. Cramp came up with the dimensions and the exact sign and signature of these type of craft, finding them by that technology in the 50s to be authentic. Since that time, Adamski's pictures have gone through biometric radiation tests. MGM Studios did an analysis on the film. They've gone through each decades of technology's analysis And they have been always found to be authentic and to be some of the best pictures ever taken. And I think one of their strong points was that they are taken 40 years ago, long before the computer technology that we have today, which certainly can composite any type of picture that we wish to. In this particular shot, we have a picture of a cigar-shaped craft with its propulsion system fully operational, so it looks like it's enveloped in a luminescent shield of fluctuating light. And it's located between the Earth and the Moon. It was taken by a 6-inch telescope Mr. Adamski took in the late 1940s. And this craft can be in dimension anywhere from 1,000 feet to several miles in length. And this craft here is the same type of craft as you see in the picture above, but you can see the outline of the hull itself. And this is in orbit in the Earth's atmosphere. And here is another craft around the Moon, and you can see it's trailing behind it the several other craft in sequence as it's around lunar orbit. And here we have another shot around the Moon, and you have here half a dozen craft in formation flying along the surface of the Moon.
In early March of 1951, through his 6-inch telescope, George Adamski was able to photograph a remarkable series of 4 photos as the large carrier-type craft was releasing 6 scout craft.
And basically this craft is what we would call a miniature city. It is in an environment that is enclosed to itself, and these bell-shaped craft, like our aircraft on an aircraft carrier, are housed in this cigar-shaped craft, and so this is used for distance travel through long distances of space.
The bright glowing effect of the craft is a result of natural particles in space coming into contact with the resonant field generated by the craft. This effect can also bend the light waves entirely around the craft, causing it to disappear from view.
What we have here is a picture of the bell-shaped, the scout-shaped craft with the 3-ball condensers underneath it. The condensers are a means in which the polarity, the electromagnetic polarity, can be shifted direction, and it's set up triangularly, so by shifting polarity from this angle to this angle, the craft maneuvers in a 3-dimensional field. And around the outside of the cabin area, there are 3 sets of 4 portholes, or 12, and that is common to all the scout crafts that have been photographed anywhere in the world, whether they're Adamski photographs or not. The scout craft never touches the surface of the planet. In other words, when it comes down to land, even when the propulsion system is shut, what you and I would consider off, there's always a trickle charge going through, so it maintains several inches off the surface of the ground. So the 3 balls that you see underneath the saucer portion of it have nothing to do with landing pod, because the craft never rests on the ground. These are part of the propulsion system that help to direct the magnetic field and the magnetic flux underneath the craft. These craft operate on what we would call a pro-gravity field. They do not believe in fighting the principles and the the forces of nature because they're far too strong. What they do is they believe in blending harmoniously in with those forces. And it's very much like you can jump against a ocean current and swim and expend a lot of energy, or you can turn around and let it carry you where it's going. And they follow the currents of electromagnetic energy through space from planet for planet. And this is how they operate. Although George Adamski may be better known for his pictures of extraterrestrial spacecraft, he was far more concerned with letting people know that it wasn't just the existence of these craft that was important, but actually who was behind it and the reasons why these people come to visit us. And I think that is to a great extent lacking today. We hear so many stories of all types of interaction and contacts that are of a fearful or harmful or aggressive nature. And this is exactly contrary to what George Adamski spoke about and what his life work was really concerned with doing. And that was to educate people into the purpose behind these contacts and the reasons that they came to talk to us and the benefits that we as a civilization can derive from interactions with these extraterrestrials.
Well, I think I've always been interested in the possibility of extraterrestrials, and I think through my own work with meditation, spiritual investigations, I've come to the conclusion that one thing that all creatures in the universe share is consciousness. All beings, all living beings. We may be different, totally different biologically, I mean, but ants, amoebas, whatever, one thing we all share is that we are conscious creatures. The nature of our consciousness, what happens in our consciousness may vary enormously, but that seems the common ground, the common bond between us and any other species there may be elsewhere in the universe. And I just, for the last few years, just been thinking a lot more about what's happening on this planet and seeing that the evolution of human consciousness has reached a crisis point, which goes along with the time when we have the potential to step out and start exploring the stars. And it seems to me that any species which gets this far has to take some sort of cosmic intelligence test, which says, are you really intelligent? Are you really wise enough to be able to use your technology for the good of the cosmos rather than just for your own ego needs? And that's the test we're facing now. And if we fail that test, then I think we will wipe ourselves out or put ourselves back to the Stone Age or something like that. Conversely, if we get through this time and develop the capacity to begin to travel, whether it's materially or psychically, across space, we will have proven that we can move beyond this egocentric phase of consciousness. We will be, to all intents and purposes, saints, wise beings, whatever you want to call it. So conversely, I feel any species that has developed the ability to be in contact with us here, again, either physically, psychically, whatever, must have gone through that itself. It must have passed its own cosmic intelligence test, which means as far as we are concerned, they must be the level of consciousness of angels or whatever. I think all the stuff about extraterrestrials being malevolent beings, they're coming here to zap us with ray guns, all that stuff is just a projection of our own fears, of our own ego, of our own warlike nature, which we've got to transcend. Any extraterrestrials must have transcended that, or they'd have wiped themselves out. So it seems to me that if we're going to consciously approach them, we need to do so on the level of consciousness, like we would approach some guru or angel or very wise spiritual beings. That's what I think they are, is wise spiritual beings relative to us.
Then at Tijuca Bar de Tijuca in Brazil, Ed Keffel took a remarkable set of pictures on 7 May 1952. Ed Kessel and Joe Martins, reporters from O Globo, a newspaper in Rio, had been sent to Tijuca Bar to photograph a groundbreaking ceremony for a new building or something. It was a political thing. And they were covering the event when, at about 4:30 in the afternoon, Martins spotted an object approaching at low level, and he thought it was an airplane at first because it looked like it. But it was too low. It was just a little above the wave tops when they saw it, and they stopped talking and stood looking at it, and they remarked on how low the airplane was, and Martin says, no, that's not an airplane, it's something else, get your camera ready. And so Joe readied his camera and started shooting pictures, and he shot a series as it approached, passed over a rocky mount rising out of the surf there, over some trees along the beach there, and then out along a beach spit where it turned up on its edge and rolled away like a coin rolling on the water as it departed. Now, the interesting thing about this series of pictures is they were newspaper reporters. There were a number of people there. There were politicians present. There were scores of witnesses. They took statements from many of them. All this was published in the local newspaper, or the Rio newspaper, on the front page. A few years later, after it had been reported and after original pictures had been obtained by APRO through Irina Granchi down there in Brazil, one of the best-known UFO researchers there, got copies from the Brazilian Air Force before they shut it back down again, who first said that it was a real object, and after some persuasion on the part of our government, changed the story, tried to substitute something else, tried to kill the pictures, and things like that. Now, I say because this was a result of interference by agents from our government is because Dr. Olavo Fontes was present. He was an Air Force flight surgeon in the Brazilian Air Force, and he was present in the general's office when the American agents came to see him on orders from here, and offered all the reasons why this should be shut down, should be stopped. And the Brazilians tried to call them back. They tried to put out cover stories to change it, just like we did the crash at Roswell. Now here's an interesting set taken at Lake Chauvet near Clermont-Ferrand in France on the 18th of July in 1950. Now we're still in 1952, you see. And this is about 4:15 in the afternoon when Mr. Andre Fragnali, an engineer, took a series of 4 photographs of an object traveling from west to east in the sky over Lake Chauvet. He was there with a truck, and he had stopped his truck, and he got out and opened a lunch pail and was getting ready to eat a sandwich when he saw the objects approaching. And he saw that it was metallic. It was not an airplane. It was disc-shaped, reflecting the sun's rays from its edge. And it appeared lighter on the top and darker underneath, and it was completely silent. And he prepared his camera and started taking pictures. He took 4 good black and white pictures at fairly low level as it passed him, and then as it began to ascend over the lake, and then departed at a steep angle, leaving the scene. These 4 pictures are among the clearest ones taken at that time. And he even watched it with binoculars for part of the time. He used a good camera. He used a Z-Cycon 24 by 36 camera with a Tessar f/45 lens, which gave him sharp photographs that lent themselves to analysis even in those days. Another object or photo of interest came to attention in 1952, also 19th of July. No, we're still in 52. This is early in the thing here. At Puerto Maldonado on the border between Peru and Brazil, Officer Domingo Troncoso, a customs inspector for Peru at the border station there, was the only one that had a camera when many people on the border station saw a cigar-shaped object passing from right to left across the sky, and it passed over the river that makes the boundary between Brazil and Peru at that point, and it was low enough to cast a reflection in the waters of the river. Judging from that, you could, since you have the reflection in the water and the object in the sky, you can triangulate and get an approximate altitude or angle of elevation from the photographer. So he took the one picture as it moved along. It was moving from right to left rather slowly, about the speed of an airplane flying, and trailing what looked like a trail of thick white smoke from the back of it. When that trail of residue settled to the ground, it turned out to be a mass of thin, fibery threads, like spider webs or flax. Today we call the same phenomena angel hair, from the angel hair you put around the bottom of a Christmas tree. And when this material has been analyzed, it has a composition something like that. It's made of boron, silicon, aluminum, and a number of other things that are present in the air that seem to be polymerized by some natural process in the either around or in the wake or in the exhaust of whatever propulsion device is using. It's a natural polymerization process that produces these fibers that are really strange fibers too, because there's been a number of them. Because they're tough, have good tensile strength. If you use inert instruments to pull them apart, if you touch them with your fingers, they turn to jelly, and they break up easily. In fact, they'll collapse of their own weight. If you put some in the palm of your hand, it just, in time, from the heat of the palm of the hand, melts down into a jelly-like mass and then turns green and then evaporates away. But this stuff has come down all over the country in the wake of UFOs, even to the extent of falling inches deep in the wake of a UFO over an area that covers 15 or 20 city blocks. A case like that happened in Bakersfield, California. There was a case in England where a fall of angel hair covered the streets and sidewalks and roofs of a town 4 inches deep, the whole town. Another interesting one, still in 1952 now. 52 was a banner year, leading up probably to the big wave in France in 1953 and 54. But in late July of 1952, we began to experience overflights over Washington. The public has been told about one, but there was a buildup of this. They began about the 22nd or 23rd of July of 1952. The first objects appeared over Washington, passed through the prohibited airspace, flew on, and disappeared. Then, on the 27th of July, a flock of them appeared over Washington at night, like a half a dozen or more, that moved through the prohibited airspace in formation. They turned the searchlights on, they sent interceptors up, and the objects successfully eluded all attempts to get them on gun camera film. Then on the night of the 29th of July, we had a score of them appear over the Capitol, and they watched them on radar. They chased them with relays of fighters. Interceptors called up one after another. They ordered one F-102 to ram one if he could, and he put it in an afterburner and tried to ram one that was in front of him, and it just flew circles around him, and as he was flying an afterburner past him, just circled him at the fastest he could go. So there was a lot of activity going on there. And on that afternoon of the 29th of July, at about 4:30 in the afternoon at Passaic, New Jersey, just above Washington, Mr. George Stock and his old father were standing out in front of Stock's yard, his house there, where he repaired lawnmowers, and they spotted a strange aircraft approaching low over the trees in the distance to the east, I guess it was. And they watched it for a minute. They could see that it wasn't not an airplane, that it wasn't a balloon, it wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't anything identifiable. And George told his father, keep an eye on it, I'm going to go get the camera. And his dad stayed out there in the front there to keep an eye on it, and George came out in time to start taking pictures, and he snapped the first picture of it still on its approach towards his house there. And then he rolled the film as it passed over their heads and started passing along the ridge line of their house. They could just see it above the ridge line. He got a second picture as it neared the ridge line, another one as it was near the far end of the roof line of the house, then one where it's out over the backyard passing away, and another one where it's moving farther away, and one more picture. They got a total of 6 pictures. Now they got them in the camera, and it was clearly nothing mundane. It was so low they could have thrown something, a rock, and hit it as it passed over them. So they discussed this, and by now a neighbor had joined them also, and they decided to take the camera and the roll of film to the local newspaper and tell them the story. So they took it to the Morning Call there. And the Morning Call newspaper photo lab took the film out of the camera, processed the film, made the prints, and printed the pictures on the front page of the Passaic Morning Call. By evening of the day they appeared in the newspaper, a man came to Stock's house identifying himself as a CIA agent, which is strange because the CIA is not supposed to be operating in the domestic borders of the United States. The CIA jurisdiction is beyond the national borders, and the FBI has a jurisdiction inside of the national borders. But we find the CIA meddling all over the place here, and I don't know how they get away with it or why they do it. But anyway, the man identified himself as a CIA officer, demanded the pictures. George refused to give them up, and finally, after some negotiation, the man agreed to settle for the negatives. He'd let George keep the pictures, and he wanted to have them take them someplace and have them tested, which George agreed to after the man provided a signed, written receipt for the documents with an address and a telephone number that checked at the time. And he carried them away, and then when George tried to get them back, he tried repeatedly to get his negatives back, and there was always an excuse why they couldn't return them. This went on for 3 months. Finally, he got angry and got an attorney who was going to file a lawsuit against the office, and they returned 5 of the 6 negatives as copy prints, but they never returned the 6th one. And George has never been able to get it back. He now has passed on. The pictures went into the hands of August Roberts, who also has passed on, and now they're in my possession. But we've never found the 6th picture.
I think, you know, whichever explanation we use is going to be a theory. Yeah. And theory is always different from reality. I mean, we can probably create, you know, more than one theory about the phenomenon. But I think the least useful approach is to try to deal with this phenomenon in the context of Cartesian Newtonian materialistic science, because there we have just the alternative. I mean, this is either a spaceship, a hardware, you know, from another galaxy, or it is hallucination. It is a phenomenon, you know, that suggests mental disease in the people who have seen it, or fraud or something in that category. And I think it's not difficult to realize that that's a fundamentally wrong approach. I mean, let's say if it were a spaceship, if it were really advanced technology, you know, we know enough about the solar system. We know they would not be coming from the planets of the solar system. So the next possibility, you know, is, you know, those are worlds that are light years away. So they would have to be using technology that we can't even imagine at this point. They would have to be either supraluminal speeds, I mean, faster than light, or interdimensional. You know, we have concepts like hyperspace, sort of technology that would be able to step out of this time-space continuum into hyperspace and then re-enter somewhere else. So if we would be dealing with this kind of technology, we couldn't ourselves distinguish those phenomena from hallucinations. I mean, you know, this would be like bringing a helicopter and color television to the pygmies, or something like that. So that's not a very useful way of thinking about it.
Dr. Richard Haynes is a physiological psychologist who has conducted numerous research and development projects for NASA Ames Research Center in San Jose, California. One such project was the design of the Proximity Operations Research Mock-up, a spacecraft docking simulator, which will eventually assist Space Station Freedom astronauts in the docking of visiting spacecraft. Dr. Haynes' interest in the UFO phenomenon began some 30 years ago. Since then, he has published several books on the subject, most recently, Project Delta, a study of multiple UFO sightings.
I first got interested in the UFO subject back in the 60s when I was doing some research on rendezvous and docking for our space program. And I had a laboratory back then that would allow me to simulate the way objects look to the astronauts when they're in outer space. And so I began to discover rather quickly that under the right lighting conditions, I could fool the viewer. I could ask the person to look at a target situation with a black background and very bright front illumination, like we have in orbit, and the person was totally unable to describe what they were seeing. They would be inaccurate in terms of the object size and shape, its distance, of course. The basic characteristics were just very misunderstood and misinterpreted. And so this led me to think that, well, I could explain UFOs. As a skeptic, if I could do this in the laboratory, then these sightings must simply be unidentified natural phenomena. And so that's how I got started, because I set out to disprove that there were such things, because I could set them up in the laboratory and fool people pretty completely. Well, after a number of years of talking to very credible witnesses, including pilots of many kind of aircraft, I came to understand that I was wrong. That as a matter of fact, there is something very definitely here that's important, that deserves serious study, and that I could not explain. I've been asked a number of times how I go about analyzing a photograph of an anomalous phenomena. Let's call it a UFO. Well, that's a good question, and it's a complex question with many levels of answers. And to make it simple, let me suggest that no single photograph that is unexplained is sufficient in itself to prove anything. And so what I like to do is take a look at the entire context in which a photograph finds itself. What do I mean by that? First of all, there's the photographer. And the photographer plays a very central role, not only in taking the photograph, but in presenting the photograph to someone else. Perhaps in providing the context information surrounding the photograph. In addition to the photographer, then you have the camera, the condition of the camera. Was it malfunctioning? How current is it in terms of its ability to take automatic exposures rather than manual exposures? You have the film that's in the camera. Is that film state-of-the-art? Was it properly chosen for the conditions, let's say the nighttime sky? This says something about not only the film and the camera, but the cameraman's ability to use proper judgment. In addition, you have the development of the film. Who did the developing? What safeguards were taken to prevent double exposures in the development process? Assuming now that the camera did not malfunction, and assuming the cameraman was not trying to carry out a hoax, and so forth. In addition to that, then you have now the developed negative. What about the processing, the enlargements, for instance? Can we, what's called dodge in or double expose a disc-like image on a rather prosaic background? Finally, you have the whole story that surrounds the time and the place the camera and the photographer and the film find themselves. And does that story match up with what's on the film? And when you take all of those events together and you examine each one carefully, and then you subject the image on the negative, the original negative, to certain special processing, let's call them photo enhancements for now, and you find no ambiguities and you find no contradictions, you've got something. You've got a real photograph which can stand the test of time and which is then at the stage of going to the next step, which is trying to match up that image on the photograph with known phenomenon, first of all. After you have exhausted all known phenomenon, only then do you progress to unknown or hypothetical phenomenon, postulated phenomenon, such as UFO, such as extraterrestrial craft, for instance. But I don't advocate doing that until I have exhausted all prosaic explanations. Over the years of looking at this phenomenon, I have studied quite a few photographs which just cannot be explained by prosaic explanations. And the reason why they can't be explained so readily is, again, where they were taken and when they were taken and the conditions under which they were taken. That's as important as the shape of the object that's seen. So, for instance, Jacques Vallée and I have analyzed a very interesting photograph from Costa Rica, taken from an airplane, looking straight down. The airplane was at 10,000 feet altitude, and the background of this object is a lake. And so the object, or whatever it is hovering over the surface of a lake. And by knowing the optics of the camera, the focal length, and so forth, we know the angular width of the object. We know its absolute distance. It can't be more than 10,000 feet. So we were able to calculate the size of this object. And what we find, based upon our analyses, is, I think, clearly a three-dimensional object, not a flat or two-plane object, with some very interesting symmetry in the surface structure, or the surface reflections, let's call it. In addition to that, I find two edges which are very smooth and continuous and parallel to each other, which think of a penny kind of seen at an angle. The two sides of the edges are rather smooth, relative, and parallel to each other. On the other hand, at the far side, I find a very undulating and irregular edge, which is very intriguing. It raises some interesting questions, and it suggests that the object, whatever it is, may possibly be submerged into the water. This actually may represent the wave border or boundary, as the object is at an angle to the water surface. The object is anomalous in that case, first of all, because there is no known, no visible means of propulsion or lift in this case. The second case, the second point is that we have a photograph taken 20 seconds before it and 20 seconds after it by an automatic camera with nobody looking at the camera. It's just doing its own exposures automatically. The object is not visible in the previous or the following, which tells us something that the object had to be appearing within that 20-second period and then disappearing after it. Well, that's anomalous. Airplanes don't do that. So we were able to calculate that if the object entered linearly and flew across the camera field of view, how fast would it have to travel in order to show up just in the middle frame? And the answer is in almost 1,000 miles an hour. The object had to be very big if it was far away, and on the order of 800 to 1,000 feet across, which makes it anomalous. Another explanation would be that it's a smaller object closer to the airplane. Nobody on board the airplane saw this. It was about 5 men on board the airplane doing a routine mapping. Well, that's just one example of a disc-shaped, three-dimensional object reflecting sunlight realistically following the laws of optics, reflection, let's say, where the object just cannot be explained as an airplane or a kite or a frisbee or some model of some sort or a balloon or many oars. And after exploring all these options and doing the analysis, we're left with a UFO, an unidentified flying object.